Across the United States, people have taken to the streets to protest the death of 46-year-old George Floyd. A video went viral showing the unarmed black man being arrested over what's reported to have been a counterfeit $20 bill. And for 8 full minutes and 46 seconds, a white police officer is seen kneeling on Floyd's neck as Floyd cries out, "I can't breathe." A month before Floyd's death, hundreds of demonstrators gathered at Michigan State Capitol demanding for the economy to reopen despite the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of those demonstrators were heavily armed, yelling to be let into the House chamber. The demonstrators were eventually allowed in, where they continued to yell their demands. So, between the two protests, can you spot the difference? Well, the protests calling for racial equality and police accountability have been met with violence.
Differences aside, the police did not resort to any sort of violence, no tear gassing, no mace, no pepper spray in those anti-lockdown protests. So qualitatively, there's absolutely a difference in the way those two protests were treated. It's funny because the job of the police is to secure your First Amendment ability to protest, right? And to de-escalate, ironically, violence.
Lonnie Yanu says one reason why we see such a difference between those two images has a lot to do with the poor relationship between black communities and the police. And there are many reasons for that. Data shows that compared to a white person, a black person is twice as likely to be pulled over for a traffic stop by police, twice as likely to be unarmed when killed during police interactions, and 3 times more likely to be killed overall by police. But that's not all. When a cop does kill a person, they aren't likely to face any charges. Between 2013 and 2019, only 1% of American police officers face charges for killing an individual while on the job.
The relationship has been so marred with distrust and abuse and misconduct that many black citizens just don't believe police are there to really protect our interests as much as they are there to protect the interests of whiteness.
There's a long history of racial oppression in the US, and Warren says what we're seeing now is the way racial oppression can unfold in dominant institutions.
And I think until we get to a place where we can seriously talk about race, the implications of race, the consequences of the racial terror that happened in the United States, the consequences of lynchings, the consequences of slavery, and how that still manifests itself in certain ways in contemporary America, these things will continue.
All the experts I spoke with had several reasons as to why law enforcement officials in the US police black people the way that they do. One reason is the perceived threat black bodies pose to officers.
Blackness is often equivalent with threat. It is often equivalent to dangerousness, suspicion, the symbolic assailant, the one who you can't really trust. And so there's no way to combat that racial tension, or there's no way to really deal with the fact that, at some dinner tables, young people are still being told that black people are dangerous. And so then they grow up and become police officers or teachers or judges or prosecutors, public defenders, and those things are still in their mind. So you have to actively work to change that.
While each police department has slightly different policies when it comes to recruiting officers, Global News reached out to the Toronto Police to inquire about its hiring practices and how it screens candidates for red flags. We were referred to its website, which reads, "The applicant is required to disclose information relating to their criminal record, police contact, driving history, credit history, education history, employment history, alcohol use, and drug use." Global News also reached out to the Office of the Ministry of Solicitor General on how police are trained to deal with racialized communities. They told us that, quote, The Toronto Police Service provides a significant amount of in-house training in addition to what we provide recruits at the Ontario Police College, unquote. As well, they told us that training is developed and delivered in a manner that reinforces principles of fairness, equity, and compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code and Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They also mentioned that all basic constable training police recruits receive 8 90-minute sessions and 2 practical skill scenarios in diversity and professional practices. But experts we spoke with say those preconceived notions are still making their way into the police force and then are compounded by police training, police policies, and police unions.
The policing practices in a particular city might disproportionately put officers in communities of color because of perception that more crime happens in those communities. A department's policies on lethal use of force, right, might be ambiguous. They might not protect, they might not be written to protect the life and the liberty of people of color. Police unions that advocate on the behalf of police officers may be particularly effective at negotiating policies, both in terms of use of force and in terms of disciplining police officers that are more likely or disproportionately more likely to use force, particularly against people of color.
But it's not just the US that has a long history of racism and police brutality. In Toronto, there was a Yonge Street protest over the police shooting of a 22-year-old black man named Raymond Lawrence in 1992, as well as the 1988 police shooting of 44-year-old Lester Donaldson. And in Montreal, there was the computer riot of 1969.
The Black students were protesting the low grades that they were received from a particular professor. The university more or less did nothing. At the end of the day, the computer room, facility was destroyed by fire. The students were blamed for it, even though the students said, we occupied it, we didn't burn it down. Nonetheless, students were deported. Many of them were from the Caribbean. Many were jailed. Many were turfed out of the universities. They lost their entire academic career.
Dr. Cooper says it's events like these in Canada and the ones we're seeing today in the US that have people protesting.
People are asking for accountability. People are saying, you have all this power in your hands as cops, but when you interact with Black people, it's as if you're interacting with a game, a bear, a lion, a rhinoceros, some kind of wild beast, that our bodies and our lives do not have the same meaning as, say, white people.
There has been a lot of debate about the best way to seek justice for Black communities and those killed as a result of police brutality, but there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. Experts say change can come in a variety of ways, including protesting, voting, changing policies, changing police unions, and changing the way police are trained.
But if there's anything I want people to really remember from this conversation, and this isn't an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to do a roll call, okay? George Floyd, Eric Gardner, Breonna Taylor, Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, Ezell Ford, Laquan McDaniel, Walter Scott, Amadou Diallo, Philando Castile, Alton Sterling, Stephen Clark, Antoine Roche, Botham Jean, Sandra Bland, Alonzo Smith, Jamar Clark, Janet Wilson, Darius Stewart, Natasha McKenna, Brian Keith Day, Dante Parker, Eric Harris, William Chaplin II, Anthony Hill, and Freddie Gray. That should make us cringe.